Winesburg, Ohio, first published in 1919, is a remarkable collection of short stories by the American writer Sherwood Anderson, who would later become the early mentor and inspiration for Ernest Hemingway. Each story in this book unfolds a different corner of a small Midwestern town, Winesburg, revealing the hidden lives, longings, and quiet struggles of its people. Anderson's writing captures the deep loneliness and unspoken dreams of ordinary men and women, painting a vivid portrait of small-town America at the turn of the century. Through these intimate tales, Winesburg, Ohio reminds us that behind every calm face lies a story waiting to be heard. The Book of Grotesque by Sherwood Anderson. It was a little hard for the old writer, with his gray mustache, to climb into bed. The windows in his house were set high above the floor, and he wanted to be able to look out at the trees when he awoke in the morning. So a carpenter was called in to build a platform that would raise the bed to the level of the windowsill. There was a good deal of fuss about it. The carpenter, a veteran of the Civil War, came into the writer's room and sat down to discuss the construction of the platform. There were cigars in the writer's room, and the carpenter helped himself to one. At first they talked about how to raise the bed, but soon the conversation drifted elsewhere. The carpenter began to talk about the war. It was really the writer who led him to it. The carpenter had been a prisoner, confined in Andersonville, and his brother had died there, starved to death. As he remembered this, the carpenter began to cry. Like the writer, he had gray mustaches, and as he wept, his lips quivered and his mustaches moved up and down. The sight of the old man with a cigar in his mouth, crying, was somewhat ridiculous. They forgot all about the bed project, and later the carpenter built it in his own way. The old writer, well into his 70s, had to climb onto the bed with the help of a chair. Lying there, he would turn on his side and be still. For many years, he had worried about his heart. He was a heavy smoker, and his heart fluttered. He had a notion that he would die suddenly. The thought did not frighten him, but it worked in him in a strange way, hard to explain. Because of it, he felt more vividly alive when in bed than anywhere else. His body was old and useless, but something inside him remained young. He was like a pregnant woman. Only instead of carrying a child, he carried within himself a kind of youth. Or perhaps not even youth, but a young woman in armor, like a knight. You see, it's foolish to try to explain what it was that lived inside the old writer when he lay in his high bed, listening to the beating of his heart. What matters is what he, or that young thing within him, thought about. In the old writer's mind, as in all minds, there had accumulated a great many notions through a long life. Once, he had been a man of some charm, and more than one woman had loved him. He knew people well, knew them in a way that seemed closer than most people do. At least, that's what he liked to believe, and it pleased him to think so. Who would argue with an old man about his own thoughts? In bed, sleep would come to the writer, or something like sleep. Between waking and dreaming, figures would begin to pass before his eyes. It seemed as though that young, mysterious thing inside him was leading a long procession of figures past him. And here's the curious part, all of those figures were grotesques. Every man and woman the writer had ever known became grotesque. These grotesques were not all ugly. Some were amusing, some almost beautiful, and one woman, twisted and pitiful in form, hurt the old writer deeply with her grotesqueness. When she passed, he whimpered like a small dog. Had you been in the room, you might have thought he was suffering from bad dreams or indigestion. For an hour the procession of grotesques passed before the old man's eyes. Then, though it tired him, he would crawl out of bed and sit down to write. Certain of the grotesques had moved him deeply, and he wanted to describe them. He worked for an hour at his desk, and in the end there was a book. He called it the Book of the Grotesque. It was never published, but I once saw it, and it made a lasting impression on me. There was one central thought in the book, very strange, and I have remembered it always. It helped me understand many people and many things that were once unclear to me. The idea, roughly simplified, was this. In the beginning, when the world was young, there were many thoughts, but no truths. Man made the truths himself, and each truth was composed of many vague thoughts. There were truths everywhere, and they were all beautiful. The old writer recorded hundreds of truths in his book. There was the truth of virginity and the truth of passion, the truths of wealth and poverty, thrift and waste, carelessness and devotion. Hundreds and hundreds of truths, all beautiful. Then the people came. Each, as he appeared, seized upon one of the truths. The strong took many, and the truths made the people grotesque. The old man had a whole theory about it. He said that as soon as a person took one of the truths to himself, called it his truth, and tried to live by it, he became grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a lie. You can imagine that a man who had spent his whole life writing, filled with words, could write hundreds of pages on such a theme. The idea grew so large in his mind that the writer himself was in danger of becoming a grotesque. But he did not. Perhaps because he never published the book. Or perhaps because of that young thing within him. That was what saved the old man. As for the old carpenter who built the writer's bed, I mention him only because among all the grotesques in the writer's book, he, like many of the so-called simple people, was perhaps the easiest to understand and to love. Hands. Along the worn veranda of a small wooden house that stood above a ravine in the town of Winesburg, Ohio, a plump little old man was nervously pacing back and forth. Beyond a wide field, sown with clover but yielding only a crop of yellow wild mustard, he could see the road, where a wagon full of berry pickers was returning from the fields. The pickers, young men and women, were shouting and laughing boisterously. A boy in a blue shirt jumped down from the wagon and tried to pull a girl with him. She screamed sharply and resisted. His feet stirred up a cloud of dust that drifted across the face of the setting sun. Over the broad field came the high, clear voice of the girl. "Hey there, Wing Biddlebaum. Comb your hair, it's falling into your eyes." She called out to the old man, who was bald and nervously ran his hands over his bare white scalp as though to smooth down unruly curls that no longer existed. Wing Biddlebaum, forever timid and haunted by ghostly legions of doubt, felt himself a complete stranger to the life of the town where he had lived for 20 years. Among all the people of Winesburg, only one had ever come close to him, George Willard, the son of Tom Willard, owner of the new Willard House. George, the only reporter for the Winesburg Eagle, would sometimes walk out along the road in the evening to visit Wing. Now, as the old man paced nervously along the porch, he hoped George might come that night. When the berry picker's wagon disappeared, Wing crossed the field of mustard, climbed the rail fence, and gazed impatiently down the road toward town. After a moment he began rubbing his hands together and glancing fearfully around, then hurried back to his porch to resume pacing. In George Willard's presence, the strange, silent man of Winesburg came partly out of his shell. The hidden personality, tossed about in a sea of doubt, rose for a moment to the surface. Walking beside the young reporter, or pacing the fragile veranda, Wing spoke excitedly. His normally trembling voice became sharp and strong. His bent back straightened. His whole body seemed to quiver like a released fish darting back into water. Wing Biddlebaum talked much with his hands. His slender, expressive fingers, forever restless, forever trying to hide themselves in his pockets or behind his back, became the machinery of his speech. The story of Wing Biddlebaum is, in truth, the story of his hands. His nickname itself had come from their restless fluttering, like the wings of a trapped bird, a comparison once made by some forgotten poet among the townsfolk. His hands even frightened him. He longed to conceal them and looked with wonder at the quiet, still hands of those who worked beside him in the fields or guided sleepy teams along the country roads. When he talked with George Willard, he often clenched his fists and pounded the table or walls of his house. It comforted him. If the urge to speak came while they were walking, he would find a fence post or tree stump and beat upon it, freeing his tongue. The story of Wing Biddlebaum's hands deserves a book of its own. Told with sympathy, it would reveal the hidden beauty of many humble souls. But in Winesburg, people noticed only the speed of his hands. With them he could pick as many as 13 buckets of strawberries in a day. They were his distinction, and his curse. George Willard often wondered about the hands. He felt sure there was a story behind their strange restlessness, and only respect for the old man kept him from asking. Once, he nearly did. One summer afternoon, they were walking together through the fields and sat down on a grassy slope. Wing had been speaking all along the road, full of excitement. Stopping at a fence, he had struck the top rail again and again, like a giant woodpecker, and shouted at George for allowing himself to be influenced by others. "You're destroying yourself," he cried. "You're afraid to dream. You want to be like everyone else in town. You listen to their talk and try to imitate them." Now, on the grassy slope, his voice grew soft, dreamy, and he began to speak like a man lost in reverie. He painted for George a picture of a new golden age. Youths walking across green fields, gathering at the feet of an old man who sat beneath a tree, speaking to them of life. Wing was swept away by inspiration. He forgot his hands. They crept softly forward and rested on George Willard's shoulders. His voice grew bold and ringing. "You must forget all you've learned," he said earnestly. "You must begin to dream. From now on, close your ears to the clamor of the crowd." When he stopped speaking, he stared long and intently at George. His eyes blazed. Then suddenly terror came into them. Wing sprang to his feet, thrust his hands deep into his pockets, and tears welled up in his eyes. "I must go home. I can't talk to you anymore," he said nervously. Without another word, he hurried down the slope and across the field, while the bewildered young man watched him go. Shivering with unease, George finally rose and walked toward town. "I won't ask him about the hands," he thought. "Something's wrong there, but I don't want to know. He's afraid of everyone, and it's got something to do with his hands." George Willard was right. Let us look into the past of those hands. Perhaps our curiosity will stir a poet to tell the strange, beautiful story of the schoolteacher whose hands were only fluttering pennants of promise. In his youth, Wing Biddlebaum had been a teacher in a Pennsylvania town. Then his name was not Wing Biddlebaum, but Adolph Myers. His pupils loved him dearly. Adolph Myers had been born to teach. He was one of those rare men whose gentle authority seems merely an expression of tenderness. His feeling toward his pupils was something pure and womanly. But only a poet could truly describe it. In the evenings he walked and talked with the boys, or sat with them on the school steps until dusk. His hands were never still, patting a shoulder, smoothing a tousled head. His voice was soft and musical, and in its gentleness there was love. Through his hands, as through his voice, he tried to awaken in them the power to dream. Then tragedy came. A dull-witted boy conceived a strange affection for the teacher. At night he dreamed indecent dreams and in the morning told them as truth. Horrible accusations filled the air. The town flared with moral outrage. The tragedy came swiftly. Boys were dragged from their beds and questioned. "He put his arm around me," said one. "He touched my hair," said another. One day the local saloon keeper, Henry Bradford, came to the schoolyard and beat the frightened teacher with his fists. "I'll show you what happens to men who touch my boy," he shouted. When he tired of striking, he kicked the fallen man again and again while the children screamed. That night, 10 men came to Adolph Myers's door with lanterns. They made him dress and go out into the rain. One of them carried a rope. They meant to hang him, but something in his small, trembling figure stopped them. They let him run into the darkness. Then, ashamed of their weakness, they chased after him, cursing and throwing clods of earth as he fled into the night. For 20 years, Adolph Myers had lived as a recluse in Winesburg. He was only 40, yet he looked 65. The name Biddlebaum had caught his eye on a packing crate at a freight station in eastern Ohio as he passed through. He had taken it for his own. In Winesburg he had an aunt, a toothless old woman who raised chickens, and he lived with her until she died. After the incident in Pennsylvania, he had been ill for a year, and when he recovered, he began working as a day laborer in the fields, shy of people and hiding his hands. He never truly understood what had happened to him, but he sensed that his hands were to blame. The fathers of his former pupils had shouted about them constantly. "Keep those hands of yours to yourself." The saloon keeper had roared in the schoolyard, dancing with rage. Wing Biddlebaum paced the porch of his little house above the ravine until the sun disappeared and the road beyond the field faded into the gray dusk. Then he went inside, sliced some bread, and spread it with honey. When the rumble of the evening train, carrying away the day's load of berries, died into silence, and the stillness of the summer night returned, he resumed his nervous walk along the porch. In the darkness he could no longer see his hands, and they were at peace. Though he still longed to see the young man, his one link to the world, his interpreter in love for humanity, that longing dissolved once again into the quiet loneliness of his waiting. Wing Biddlebaum lit a lamp, washed the dishes from his meager supper, placed his cot behind the screen door, and began to undress. On the freshly scrubbed floor near the table lay a few crumbs of white bread. He moved the lamp to a low stool and began to pick them up, carrying each crumb quickly to his mouth. In the bright pool of light beneath the table, the kneeling man looked like a priest performing some solemn ritual. His nervous, expressive fingers darted in and out of the light, like the hands of a monk slipping the beads of a rosary, decade after decade. The next story from Winesburg, Ohio awaits you. Follow the link below to keep exploring the lives of Winesburg's people. More jazz music on the Golden Jazz Music channel. Link in the description below the video.